Great. I think we can start. So welcome everyone to our conversations on social reproduction. I'm particularly delighted to welcome Professor Enrica Rigo today, who is at the University of Roma Tre, where she's a lawyer and she holds a chair in the philosophy of law. And apart from being a philosopher of law, she also manages a rather busy legal clinic on migration and asylum, which we'd love to hear more about that. And her research interests include critical legal theory, theories of citizenship, and border studies, as well as asylum and gender studies. And she's the author of 2 books, which are in Italian. One was published in 2007 and the other in 2022. So we are particularly delighted to hear from her today because there aren't too many feminist legal scholars who draw explicitly on social reproduction theory. So it's an absolute treat for us to hear from Professor Rigo and also to join the dots between what seem to be quite discrete areas of critical legal scholarship, which is around the right to mobility and questions of labor and reproduction. So thank you very much, Professor Rigo. I'll now pass over to you. We can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you, Prabha. I'm very happy to speak in this very stimulating series of seminar. And I entitle my presentation today, Mobility, Social Reproduction and Exploitation, a critical legal perspective on the tension between capitalism and freedom of movement. I will try to put mobility and the claim for freedom of movement at the center of a scene as an essential element of social reproduction processes. As Prabha was saying, my theoretical work is also based on the work of a legal clinic on migration and citizenship that I've been coordinating for over 13 years now, and so also draws on this practical experience of migration. A wide range of literature has placed social reproduction at the center of migration processes. I'm thinking right now especially on literature about gender and social reproduction and the contribution of domestic workers to the reproduction of societies on a global scale. Although very differentiated, this body of literature has mainly considered mobility as functional to reproduction processes of either labor force of society as a whole, and has really focused on the entanglements between mobility and social reproduction as such. In this brief presentation, I will argue that from a critical legal perspective, such entanglements are crucial for developing a feminist view on border and migration that goes beyond the analysis of the female component of migration processes. So my intent is to show how social reproduction is the lens through which we can look from a feminist perspective to migration processes in their whole dimension. My argument follows 2 lines. On the one side, such a focus reveals the extent to which regimes of mobility control are structured and perpetrate the conceptual separation between production and reproduction. So the first part will concern mobility control. On the other side, such entanglements between mobility and social reproduction, I believe, can say a lot, can be a feminist critical lens to look at exploitation processes. So these are my two lines of argument. In an influential book of critical border studies, Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nilsson have introduced the idea of multiplication of labor to describe the impact of borders regime in the selective inclusion of migrant workers. I believe that although this view is very important, it is partial unless it also takes into consideration how borders coercively multiply and impose regimes of reproduction that allow disenfranchisement and therefore pose the conditions for exploitation. I start with a quote that is a quote from a classic of the Marxist anthropologist Claude Meillassoux, that already back in the 70s affirmed that to grasp capitalist exploitation, the problem must be set in the more general terms of the conditions of production and reproduction of labor power. So exploitation must be framed in the connection between these two conditions. And since the 70s, materialist feminist theory has questioned the conceptual distinction between production and reproduction. And of course, my reference is especially to the work of feminist theorists such as Silvia Federici, Antonella Picchio, Donatella Maria Rosa della Costa. So all this body of work that refers to workerist Marxist, but I believe that this body of thinking is far from being exhausted and it still needs to be addressed from a critical legal perspective. Legal studies haven't yet given enough attention to this body of work. So I will go to the first part of my argument. As already mentioned, the conceptual separation between production and reproduction structures legal regimes of mobility control. We can give several examples of this separation. I believe that family reunification perhaps provide the most immediate example. The migrants who hope to bring a family member into their country of destination will be asked to demonstrate an income sufficient for the maintenance of themselves and their family, while the contribution that the family members provide to the reproduction of the worker, from making breakfast to ensuring a good night's sleep, finds no recognition whatsoever in the legal scheme for entrance. Similar consideration can apply to the access to citizenship rights that is still tailored around the figure of the productive citizen. If we think at the European Union level, I believe that an example is the discipline relating to the free circulation of workers was norm, according to the European Court of Justice, only apply to, I quoting here, effective and genuine activities to the exclusion of activities as such as small scale to be regarded as marginal or ancillary. The European Court of Justice uses word ancillary. Of course, reproductive labor, principally performed by women and without pay, is almost entirely excluded from this definition. So I think to summarize this point, that it's possible to claim that the evaluation of care and reproductive labor is not only a matter of unpaid work, but is also a matter of the legal and political value that unrecognized, that is not recognized to this set of activities. And the load of work shouldered by women or other caregiving figures in favor of their families, communities, non-sufficient subject does not count as viaticum to assess legal status and rights on the territory. This is true with regard to citizenship as a substantial concept. Of course, it's much more true when we think about figures as migrants that are excluded from formal citizenship. So, and this is the point. At the same time, this lack of recognition, of course, strengthens relation of personal dependence from husbands, fathers, and other official wage winners that perpetuate patriarchal hierarchies and racialized constraints. But just to close this first part of the argument, in my opinion, it is above all through the categories of economic migration and forced migration and the different mobility regimes deriving from these categories that the conceptual separation between the space of production and reproduction becomes evident. The entire regime of refugees and international protection seekers has been historically constructed in opposition to the image of the industrious citizen. Forced migration is designed by the law as a transitory condition, not destined to stabilize within countries of arrival and therefore not entitled to autonomous choices about their living and working condition. So the result of this framing of the issue, the result is the imposition of what we could call as regimes of humanitarian reproduction, from refugee camps to reception centers for asylum seekers, to rehabilitation shelters for victims of violence, for example, sexual violence and similar, where control extends from mobility to the life itself. I think that this is more and more clear when we look at the humanitarian agenda in mobility control, and we need to put social reproduction at the center to have a lens to read these processes. The second part of my argument looks at exploitation and the entanglement between mobility and exploitation. When exploitation is approached from a critical legal perspective, I think it's easy to notice that the law incorporates exploitation according to a contractual model. Other scholars speak about transactional model. While profit extraction is the legitimate scope of the labor contract and even a constituent component of the parties' obligation, the law tackles and limits exploitation when a defect of consent is present and demonstrated. To use the words of the Palermo Protocol, the protocol for contrasting transnational criminality, exploitation is unlawful and therefore relevant for penal and international law in presence of threats or use of force, other form of coercion, abuse of power, or abuse of a position of vulnerability. So, what is the problem here? As noticed by the international law scholar Susan Marks, this consent-based model reduces exploitation to a form of contingent injustice, that is a matter of force or abuse that occurs between the perpetrators and the victims, rather than a political issue related to structural condition. Furthermore, this contractual model erases from the picture the multiple beneficiaries of exploitation. Or, and I use here a different language, the language of materialist analysis, it diverts the attention from the process of capitalist accumulation. Even leaving aside different views on the generation of value, I think that it is undeniable that social reproduction processes constitute an unacknowledged supplement to capitalist accumulation. I use this expression of unacknowledged supplement taken it by Gargi Bhattacharya. Capitalist accumulation that must be seen beyond contractual relations and wages. In turn, this supplement needs is a stake and also to show the limits of the law when tries to tackle exploitation, the law in the sense that I just explained. I will elaborate on this point by returning to the argument that borders coercively multiply reproduction regimes, and in doing so, borders lower the conditions of reproduction of the labor power. We can take several examples by looking at labor sectors where the component of migrant workers prevail. Migrant domestic workers that cohabit with employers do not necessarily choose, in most cases they never choose, to this kind of accommodation, but is rather a requirement imposed by the legislation on the entrance and residence in the country. At the same time, these requirements, even if they are set by the migration and not by the labor law, lower the cost of reproduction of this specific labor force. By moving from domestic to agricultural workers, the cases of self-built shelters or the tent camps where migrant seasonal workers live nearby the tomato fields and the citrus groves in southern Italy, for example, provide another effective example. The living conditions of migrant seasonal workers are often denounced by media and politicians as evidence of semi-slavery exploitation. Rarely, this analysis takes into consideration the supplement of profit provided to the food industry by the way in which the agricultural labor force is reproduced. More than simply a question of low wages, it is exactly this material condition of life that allow for the reduction of cost in the value chains. So rather than a side effect of the gangmaster system, we could say that these ghettos of migrant workers, so-called ghettos, represent a mode of reproduction. I use this expression. A mode of reproduction of labor power that is co-constitutive to the agricultural mode of production. In other words, it's impossible to think that the tomato chain is produced at this low cost without this kind of life reproduction. At the same time, and this is a political point for me, these material level conditions are not objective circumstances, as Antonella Picchio, the feminist economy, always point to this necessity of denaturalize the circumstances in which life is reproduced, but are the consequence of the regimes of mobility control. In the same way, refugee camps, containment centers for asylum seekers are not objective condition of migrants' life reproduction, but are rather determined by political decisions that coercively impose regimes of the reproduction of life. So I think that the length of social reproduction is crucial to acknowledge the structural dimension of exploitation beyond the narrow legal definition that reduces to an unfair relation among the parties. I also believe the recent decisions of the European Court of Human Rights on the issue of forced labor point to the same direction when indicate vulnerability as a condition related to the status of irregular migration. Although the court, of course, does not use the same language of materialist feminism, it uses a different language, but the attention of the decision is drawn to the basic needs and services that are essential to the maintenance and the reproduction of life. I think that this point of critique about the consensual model, the contractual model of exploitation is also relevant on a general term. I go back once again to Claude Melessi because we tend to imagine the competition on wage in terms of a competition within the market of wages, within the circulation sphere. But for in Marxist theory, it's clear that exploitation has much to do with the sphere of the exchange, but rather with the sphere of the production. I here again quote Mayusi. It has been clear since Marx that supply and demand, where they do operate, do not explain the level at which wages are fixed in the long term once the equilibrium has been reached. this level is established by the cost of the reproduction of the labor power. So this is where we have to look when we look at exploitation. We can say it in a different way, as observed once again by Gargi Bhattacharya in this book, Rethinking Racial Capitalism. Racial capitalism ascribes the subject into a hierarchical set of relations, both in the spheres of reproduction as much as in the fields of production. And these two horns of the problem must to be kept together. As a last point that I put it also as a point of discussion, I believe that the length of social reproduction analysis on migration provides a radical feminist view on the claim of freedom of movement by bringing to the foreground the challenge that the reproduction and the maintenance of life pose to the reciprocally sustaining systems of capitalism, patriarchy, and colonialism. What is at stake in mobility control is not only labor regimes, but the way in which growing shares of the planet population are forced to reproduce their life. Borders are instruments of this imposition. Borders distribute as member says about necropolitics, life and death, more and more life and death. And thank you. I think that my time is over. And so we have time for discussion and also for clarification of some of the arguments.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Enrica. That was really, really quite fascinating, and tying together so many different sets of literature, I think was very, very productive and a lot to think about. So we have some time for questions. You can, raise your hand. Feel free to, ask Enrica any questions you may have. Go ahead, Shireen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed listening to you, as always. I wanted to, because I've been doing some work on a different kind of mobility, which is commuting to work. And I'm trying to connect production with social reproduction through the arc of commuting. And I was wondering whether mobilities and borders that you have described can be also seen in the context of different kinds of mobilities, which is, it could be internal migration within borders, not across borders. But those borders could be fairly robust as well in terms of rural and urban. It could be mobilities along the spatiality of class. So if I think about domestic workers crossing sort of, the landscape, a city landscape. So are you suggesting in your talk that we need, as feminists and materialist feminists in particular, to think about mobilities with borders as affecting regimes of exploitation and regimes of social reproduction? Or can mobility in itself be an important lens through which to understand social reproduction?
Okay, thank you, Shireen. This is, of course, a very stimulating question. Actually, I have the feeling that I maybe compressed too much my argument because I was concerned with time. And this is an occasion to yes, to develop. Okay, I think that mobility is central in both ways. When legal regimes of mobility control when we look at regimes of mobility control as structured in around this separation between production and reproduction, we see the centrality of mobility in social reproduction processes. Of course, social reproduction, what is needed for social reproduction is an historical problem, is not given once for all. And exactly in this term, I believe that in contemporary society, in the contemporary world, mobility provides an essential component of reproducing life. When I think about Antonella Picchio definition of social reproduction has those set of activities and processes that we use that are needed also to develop our identity. Mobility nowadays is crucial, and is crucial also to jump among classes. And this is, of course, one side of the problem. The other side is that freedom of movement, mobility intended as the claim of freedom of movement, is not a uncontested claim. Even within feminism, even within materialist feminism, there is this scholar Apostolova. She worked a lot on labor migration inside Europe. And, she used this expression, when the welfare state doesn't give you, withdraw, doesn't give you the support to your social reproduction, your only chance is circulation. And so and this can also lead to a critique to the idea of free circulation as a regime that support neoliberal policies. Of course, I think that this view is very problematic because, when migrants claim for freedom of movement, of course, they claim for something different. They don't claim for the governmental regime of mobility. They claim for freedom. And this is the point where I think our struggle, our alliance in the struggle should insist. I don't know if is a reply. Thank you. And of course, also, you were talking about commuting and commuting to work. I mean, the space of social reproduction, also the urban space, I think is a very intriguing issue, especially from the legal theory point of view, and definitely, of course, is very important for me.
Yeah, I think, Shireen, your work also, your comments also reminded me of the work of some of the feminist legal scholars who are talking about, zoning regulations as a way of, expanding or shortening the time required for mobility between spaces of production and reproduction. So I think that's really very productive. So, I mean, while we wait for other questions, I had a couple of questions for you, Enrica. I think the first one, I was very taken in by your comment on the regimes of humanitarian reproduction. I mean, it's such a wonderful term. And I think you've drawn for us, you painted a picture of different spaces of reproduction, which then, lead to the exploitation of workers and to, surplus for capitalists and so on. It's very vivid. But I guess the question of temporality is very important also for migrants, right? So when you're talking about, and on what terms you can engage in the market or not, right? So if you're an asylum seeker, you don't have the right to work, right? But if you're, and you could spend a very long time waiting, to be sorted by states into various categories. So, and what you said about forced labor being a transitory condition so that it will get better. And there's a lot of work on, the T visas, the trafficking visas, which show that actually people get the visa, they become, there's a pathway to citizenship, but then they're back in the same kinds of very exploitative labor, which is, below minimum wage. So I'm very interested in the relationship between law and temporality, and also this thing of circularity, right? Because a lot of migrants, because they don't have a pathway to citizenship, will come for a contract of 1 or 2 years, and then they have to leave, and then they have to come back. There are restrictions on how much they can come back and forth. So that is one question. The second question was your really interesting and important call to kind of focus on the structural conditions. And certainly in the realm of sort of forced labor and trafficking, what has tended to happen is the more the structuralist view, you're never really sure whether that would lead to a positive legal outcome or not. Because it's obviously the radical feminists who've been focused most on structural dimensions, which leads to, of course, looking at sex work as purely exploitation. But there are others who may not have an exceptionalist view of sex work, but generally have structuralist perspective. But it often means including more people in the carceral network of anti-trafficking laws, right? So it's never really clear whether, if you're proved to be a forced laborer, whether that is good or not, and how expansive. It's a very elastic concept of force, right? You can make it very broad, but in fact, it may not produce a positive outcome. Where both labor law, labor law protections have only been, receding, right? And I guess the final question was, of course, more thoughts on how we can think of migration as a decolonial and anti-patriarchal practice under current conditions, where, certainly in the UK, even the Modern Slavery Act was subject to a lot of critique, but today it's collapsed into even that has, we've gone back so much on even what seemed to be gains of the Modern Slavery Act. I'm just curious what, interested if you have examples from other parts of the world on this.
Okay. Wow. Okay. I start from your second question, if this is okay for you. And so I summarize the question in this way. To look at the structural condition of exploitation may lead to an expansion of repression, repressive measure, expansion of control. I don't know, I didn't think in these terms, because when I started to be involved in the issue of work exploitation, it was through the clinic, through the legal clinic. And for me, it was a surprise to find out that in law, exploitation is not dealt by labor law, but by criminal law. I was, what? Why it is? And so in the argument, I followed this idea of Susan Marks, that one of the problem is exactly, what lays behind this call for criminal law is this idea of exploitation as abuse, as a violent act between the perpetrator and the victim. So, of course, that was the way in which I developed the argument. In my opinion, we need to look at the structural condition of exploitation. I mean, the law is not something given. I think we can agree about that. It's something artificial to push from a different approach, and I definitely agree about that. And this different approach is the approach that in my experience, that is of course a limited experience. My experience was mainly about agricultural workers in the south of Italy. They were asking what they were asking for. They were not asking for put in prison the employer. They were not interested in that. And that's a matter of penal law. They were asking for housing condition, wages, because the problem of criminal law is also that they size the enterprise. They close down the enterprise and workers don't get the money anymore. So, of course, they don't want even to denounce, in most cases. And so there is this need to move in a different direction. The other point, the other experience I had was with sex work. Once again, the so-called women, trafficked women for sexual exploitation. Here again, we represented in the clinic in the years of the so-called migration crisis from 2015 to 2018, around 300 women, so really a lot. Very, very few were interested in putting their pimps to jail, their traffickers to jail. That was not their problem. Their problem were rights, assessing rights. And so for me, it was very important to move the discourse from violence to social reproduction. I give one last example. Transgender women. We are the only organization, reality, whatever, in Rome that assist legally, provide legal assistance for transgender women. Most of them are sex workers and anti-trafficking, transgender migrant women. Anti-trafficking organizations do not assist these women unless they do not go out from sex work. But that's the only way in which they can reproduce their life, And once again, their body is really a mean of production. And when Shirin talks about depletion, it would be very interesting for me also to, to think about depletion in the way in which institutions determine what is depletion, institutional discourse. You know, in many of these cases, in some of these cases, these women have also health problems determined by surgery. Why? I mean, of course, we would need an institutional imagination, but maybe we could think about this problem as depletion. We could think about this problem as a professional health problem, you know, problems related to their working condition, because their body is the instrument of their work, their reproduction. So maybe I talk too much about it. This was just one of the questions. The other one is about temporality. I would reply connecting temporality to crisis. These ideas of migration crisis. Crises have a starting date, 2015, the migration crisis. We have, you know, before 2015, we had 2011, the Arab Spring and the crisis determined by the border crisis determined by Arab Spring. They have a starting date that never ends. Crisis never ends. They stabilize this emergency system. So I think it's also very important to show how, for example, reception crisis in migration are different crises, are social reproduction crises, and it should become problematic, non-acceptable that you reproduce share of your population through refugee camps. To reproduce labor force is a typical function of the state, but I mean, when we have schools, hospitals, housing program is one thing. If we reproduce shares of our population through refugee camps, this should become a problem. So I think that the social reproduction lens is crucial to put together temporality and social reproduction, as well as circularity, because of course, and I close on this, you know, if we go back to Simmel, who is the stranger, German sociologist, Georg Simmel, he was the one that comes today and stays tomorrow. He stays tomorrow. It's not a wanderer. And in order to stay, he must be a female stranger, not biologically intending a female stranger as a biological ascription, but because we need to problematize the fact that he needs also the space of his own reproduction. And this is what we border more and more limit, compress. The last question was about migration as a decolonial practice. This is an expression that I've taken by Tendai Acumen, the international law scholar that is also a critical international law scholar from the so-called third world approach to international law. And she says that giving the condition of decolonial, institutional decolonizing process that was never really a decolonizing process, the freedom of movement, the mobility of migrants, when aims at reaching a higher degree of equality, social equality, should be considered as a radical political practice of a radical political decolonial practice. Of course, you know, the mobility is the entitlement to mobility is one of the mark of class nowadays, more and more. And so to reclaim from below this right to mobility, that is also a right to social mobility. Definitely, I completely agree about this. And we should also to use old words that we used to work, to use social mobility, class, equality, I mean, is very, very important. So I don't know in reference to this specific situation of UK, but on a general level, I think this view is quite important.
Thank you so much. That was really very helpful. Are there any other questions or comments for Enrica?
Enrica, thanks for bringing up the issue of depletion, because I think I was obviously thinking about that too as you were speaking. And I think also mobility, I mean, I think maybe one of the things that we need to think about collectively as materialist feminists is to think about how mobility in different contexts allows us to think about capitalism differently, and sort of, you know, because I'm thinking, I was just doing a quick Google search on mobility and social reproduction, and the sort of kind of material that is available goes all the way from education, a lot on education, to migration. Obviously, that's a big issue for us all. But I think I was reading some stuff on South Africa and racialization of space and mobility, right? We know, especially in the global South, sort of, you know, mobility and education is not just about social mobility going up, but it's also about attracting violence, and, you know, when you walk along unlit roads or whatever. So I think it's such a rich scene that you've opened up for us. But I just wanted to thank you and say yes. After this, maybe another time, I also wanted to talk to you about something which I'm interested in, and you mentioned, which is the idea of consent. And where does the issue of consent and mobility figure? You know, because of course, as you know, when we were talking about depletion, we think about sort of, you know, how consent doesn't matter, because in a way, manufacturing consent goes hand in hand with the understanding of what a family is and what social reproduction normatively ought to be. So I think, but that's a long discussion, and I hope we'll have it either here in London or in your lovely city of Rome. So thank you so much. It was really interesting.
Thank you, Shirin, and thank you, Prabha, and also to all the audience that was here.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we don't have any other questions, but, you know, this will be available on YouTube, and I think would be actually a very useful learning tool for certainly in law courses where we teach around questions of, you know, asylum, migration, trafficking, and so on. So thank you very, very much for that critical legal gift that you brought to us. Thanks again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you to you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.